Hi, everybody. Welcome. I feel like I've been on the AI circuit today. We've had such amazing conversations. Maybe a quick show of hands. Who's been at another AI panel? Okay. The dedicated ones. I love it. Ladies, welcome. We were just commenting. It's great to have an all-women panel. We've got Lila Ibrahim, who is COO at DeepMind, Christina Montgomery, Christina's at IBM, and Alondra Nelson, who is at the School of Social Science Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you guys so much for being here. Maybe one more show of hands. I asked this question in San Francisco at a dinner I was at recently, and I want to know what the makeup is here. Put your hand up if you think that generative AI is a net benefit to society. Put up your hand if you think it's a net negative to society. There's a few. Put your hand up if you just really are not sure. Fair enough. Like I said, I was at a dinner in San Francisco, a lot of technologists around. Every single hand in the room was net benefit. How do you guys feel about that? Is that something to be worried about, Lila?
Like any transformative technology, I think there are benefits and risks, and we have to be talking about the risks. I think we have a lot we can learn from past technologies as well, but I don't think any of us would be in this field and on this topic if we didn't believe in the net benefit. And I'm hopeful we can talk about some of that, because I actually think it's quite quite an opportunity to think about how AI might be a tool to help us with some of the world's greatest challenges.
I should ask the question to all of you as well. I guess yours is net benefit. Christina, can you say?
Yeah, no, I would say the same. I absolutely agree that the potential for AI, and particularly the potential that's been generated recently with foundation models, is hugely beneficial to solve some major societal problems. But obviously, we have to have these conversations about, how do we ensure that what we're using it for is beneficial.
Yep,
and not dangerous.
And that's why we're here. Alondra,
yeah.
last one.
I would say it's an open empirical question whether or not it's going to be a net benefit. And I think we are early enough in the sort of cresting of this technology that there's a lot that we can do on this panel in this room to actually make it a net benefit. But I don't think the net benefit is going to be the sort of natural endpoint that we reach there. So I'm really encouraged that there's been several conversations here on AI, because it's a conversation that we all need to have, whether or not we're experts in the field or not.
Mm-hmm. Let's put this another way. We'll start with the positive. What is your biggest hope for this platform shift?
Well, I think the thing I'm most excited about is how AI can be used as a tool to really help us advance science to benefit humanity. And one of the recent areas we've been doing work on is around the area of protein folding, which is the building blocks of life. And we've actually used AI as a tool to help us solve a 50-year-old problem in biology, where we can predict the 3D structure of a protein. And now 1 million researchers are using the AlphaFold AI database to add like a Google search to discover how a protein folds. And that's important because it's helping us understand diseases. It's helping us fight things like plastic pollution and industrial waste, and coming up with new vaccines for malaria. So I think that's it, and we're just at the start of all of this. So that's the area I'm most excited about, is how can we use AI tools to help us really understand the sciences.
So that's the science aspect of it. Christina, what about you? What's your greatest hope for the technology?
I mean, those are great examples, and I could offer similar ones, but I would offer a different one in the context of education, for example. I think education is an area where we can apply AI to develop really personalized learning experiences that will help to address the discrepancies in education today, where there isn't that ability to get it's a one-size-fits-all approach. So really bringing up people who need personalized experiences, I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space.
Okay, and Alondra, round it out for us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my answers are, so I come here from the Institute of Advanced Study, where I'm a professor, but I spent the last 2+ years in the leadership of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So I think that the science examples are tremendously important. AlphaFold is one I use anytime I'm asked this question. I think it's tremendously important. I think, the sort of don't look up success that we've just had, so the DART mission that NASA just successfully completed was done with years of artificial intelligence simulation and modeling that allowed the sort of kicking of an asteroid off its orbit. It's a planetary defense system is tremendously important. Obviously, we've been using AI and continue to use it for climate change and for climate prediction. So there's lots of really great, I think, applications, particularly in the science space. I will say, the concern is as we get closer to people, and I'm sure that we'll probably have that conversation as well. But yeah.
Okay, now my second part of this question, what is your greatest fear with this shift relating to generative AI? Yes,
okay.
please.
So I have 30 years of background in the tech space, and it's not in machine learning or artificial intelligence. In fact, 5 years ago when I was interviewing at what's now Google DeepMind, I had to make the decision, was this the field, was this the organization, was this the technology that I wanted to spend this kind of final stage of my company career at? And I really felt a moral calling because I thought if I can bring my experience of bringing new technologies into the world, then I'd like to bring that to an organization that I felt could do it in a positive way. But the questions I asked myself was like, oh, can I put my daughters to sleep at night? No, and them knowing what mommy's like, what did mommy work on? And I think that really raised a lot of questions for me of like, what could go wrong? And it's pretty easy. Thanks to a lot of movies and sci-fi books, we can imagine things that we might not have otherwise imagined, and on the heels of other technology transformations. So I think for me, it's like right now, I can't imagine it. Does it scare me? Yes. And I think to Alondra and Christina's point earlier, we need to be having the conversation so we don't go down that path. It's a nice cautionary tale. So that's.
You thought about sort of the professional and the moral side of this when you went into, and maybe just for our audience too, could you explain what you're doing and how DeepMind relates to Google?
Okay.
Those that may not know.
Yeah, so in my job, first of all, let me start with DeepMind. DeepMind was started in 2010 as an AI research lab. We're headquartered in London, if you can't tell by my accent. But I moved over from Silicon Valley to join DeepMind. It was acquired by Google in 2014. And we recently merged within Google all the AI research organizations into a single organization called Google DeepMind. I'm Chief Operating Officer, and my job as COO is to oversee how we organize ourselves to deliver to our mission, as well as all the work around governance and responsibility, and then how we partner with the external world, both to share our knowledge and expertise around AI, as well as bring diverse perspectives back in so that the technology we're working on can have the type of positive impact that we aspire to have.
Great. Christina, I'll ask sort of the double header to you. What are you most afraid of in terms of generative AI, the possibilities of it, and explain your work at IBM also, what you focus on.
Sure. On the first question, I think this is the capability and the possibilities of this technology is forcing us for the first time in a long time to really think about what it means to be a human and what we're going to use technology for and not use it for. I think often we just have been marching down the path of there's a technological solution to something and we should adopt it. We should constantly be looking to adopt new technologies and use them in our companies, in our lives, whatever that may be. And now I do think that we need to back up and start questioning what should we be using this technology for? Remember to keep humans at the center. So it's less about the technology and the risks associated with that from my perspective, but the risks associated with what humans do with the technology that is concerning me.
So similar to that, I don't know if anyone was at that first panel, but the humans you're worried about, not necessarily the AI in human hands. Yeah. That may be sort of a theme that's emerging. Alondra, are you worried about that? What is your biggest fear that this could become?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest fear is that we will squander the opportunity to use these technologies and to steer them in a way that can have mutual, maximum benefit, and that we don't use this window of opportunity that we have now to create the guardrails and the things that we need to make sure that the technologies are used in the way that we want to use them. So my fear would be that we create AI systems and tools and use them in enterprises and ways that, and introduce them in ways that make people distrustful, and so that we're never able to sort of fully maximize their use. And so that's not
what does that look like?
Well, it looks like, facial recognition technology that is inaccurate and it's not fully effective, and that is deployed in the world, and is, more dangerous for, I think, certain communities than others for both technical and social reasons, and that we continue to use it and don't fix it, right? One of the things that I worked on at the White House is kind of a draft policy document called the Blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. The first of those principles is that effective systems should be both safe and effective. So a facial recognition technology system that is failing to do its work correctly is neither safe nor effective. So I worry that we will create, I know the panel this morning talked a lot about misinformation and disinformation. Obviously, AI systems and tools can really do that at scale and at a velocity that we've not experienced before, and it won't necessarily take a lot of expertise,
right.
So kind of anyone can do it potentially. And so, if we're not mindful, I think that we will be introducing transformative, powerful technology in which people feel fearful and don't feel excited about.
These are such great answers to begin, because you all believe in the opportunity, but I think told the audience that it's very nuanced. And we're at this critical moment, right? As you said, Lila, the reason you decided to do this work is because you have a moment in time right now to set it on the right path. Are you encouraged by what you're seeing so far, the conversations that are happening in Washington, the collaboration between private and public, and Sam Altman going to Congress? It's felt way more collaborative than what we've seen between big tech and Congress over the last 10 years. Are you optimistic we are on the right path to harness the opportunity of this shift?
Yeah, we're still very early in this.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm very hopeful. I'm generally an optimistic person, and I'm pleased to see the conversations happening. I think it's going to take a lot more, though, and this isn't easy, right? And it's not going to be a silver bullet. So it's going to take that type of sustained conversation. And I'm, delighted to see, I think what Alondra mentioned as well, like in the U.S., some of the work that's happening. But AI is not a technology that you can confine to any one country, and there's no national boundary. So we're having similar conversations in the UK, where I've been participating in the UK AI Council and advising the government. There's work in the EU, and I think what's really important here is how do we have international collaboration between governments and the industry and also civil society. If this technology is going to have the type of transformative impact and benefit that we hope it can have, we're going to need to include a lot more people in these conversations that traditionally haven't had a voice in the development of the technology.
That's really hard to do, though, to get everyone on the same page. Eric Schmidt this morning, he said that the U.S. is set to keep its leadership here because it's more unfettered. What they're doing in Europe and China has the possibility to stifle this transformative technology. So in your opinion, Christina, should we be working? Should we be a little bit more wary? Full steam ahead, is that the right way to go right now to keep that leadership? Or do you give something up by doing that also?
Yeah, I think, I recently testified in front of Congress as well on this topic, and I shared that I think you can have innovation, and you can have responsible technology, and you can have competition all at the same time. But we have to, a lot of what we're talking about today is companies have to be accountable for the technology that they're deploying, and they have to make decisions about whether this is something you can and should deploy. And governments need to foster conversations among not just companies or a small set of companies or just technologists. They have to be societal conversations, right? These are issues that are bigger than just the technology, which comes back to my point about what am I so afraid of? The most thing that I'm afraid of is misuse. I don't think there's been enough focus in a lot of these conversations, and particularly in the technology world, on what are the trusted technologies? How do we do things like ensure the AI that's being deployed is being deployed in a transparent way, so you always know when you're interacting with AI, that you're disclosing things about the models and about the data used to train the models, so that users can make decisions about whether they're going to use it or not, based on what they know the data is found. Because a lot of this comes back to the data, and frankly, a lot of the data is not fair,
Yeah.
right? It's not comprehensive, or
Not
it
correct.
has a lot of false,
Yep.
information in it. So these are the kinds of issues that I'm very glad to see generative AI having us focused on having conversations about, because a lot of us, I mean, I know all of us, we've been doing this for a couple of years now.
So I've been covering big tech on the Hill for many years now, and it comes down to a lot of political grandstanding, a lot of political theater. Does it feel different to you, Alondra, with this time around, generative AI? They're not just trying to put Zuckerberg on stand and sort of ask him questions for their constituents. Do you feel positive that they're trying to understand it, that these guardrails, should they go into place, are best done in the public or the private sector?
I do think it's a very different moment, and that the people's sort of attitudes and willingness to collaborate in Washington really reflect that. I think that it's certainly the case that there's lessons learned about social media, the lack of regulation to the extent that it was regulated, whether or not it was done correctly or incorrectly. So I think there's a sense of humility in Washington, both on the Hill and in the executive branch about this. There's also, I think, an important sense that this is an everybody's policy issue. So I think even in your coverage or conversations that you all would have had in Washington would have been with sort of tech policy people in a very narrow way.
Yep.
And it is clearly the case. I mean, the hearing that you're talking about that Christina participated in with Sam Altman and Gary Marcus really suggests that this is a domestic and international policy issue of large scale, and that people get that. And so I think it's been encouraging to see legislators really responding to that and understanding that any kind of policy issue that they work on really probably has a crosscut with artificial intelligence, even as it's used now or might be used in the future. And I think the other encouraging thing from that hearing, we'll just take that as an N of one, is that, the staffs had briefed their principals very well. I mean, there was not as much grandstanding. The questions were very good. They were sophisticated. They were smart. The answers were good. So I think that demonstrates that people are doing their homework and taking this very seriously as well. But a lot more remains to be done. I mean, this is because it is an issue that cross-cuts every other policy issue. There are some things that we can use. There's some regulatory powers, levers that things can be used now, and then there's going to be policy imagination and innovation that needs to happen in this space as well, only some of which is regulation. There's all sorts of other things that need to happen as well.
So this discussion we've had over the last 5 minutes or so, it's incredibly encouraging, it's optimistic. Let me step back again and ask, does it matter? Have we sort of taking the genie out of the bottle? Is it possible to regulate something that is growing so fast, that is growing more powerful? The anecdote on the last panel, I think, is a human hears 1 billion words in their lifetime. These models, right, Lila, they hear trillions. Can we properly regulate this space? And we know how long it takes to get, even though the intention is there, politics in Washington make it so that it's hard to do this stuff, put those guardrails in place.
I mean, technology is so important that we have to regulate it, and we have to regulate it well.
Doesn't mean we have.
There's work to be done. I think one thing to remember is, yes, the technology is going to become even more general, more capable. It's going to go multimodal. So it may feel like all of a sudden this has hit, but as mentioned by my colleagues, we've been working on all of this for a while. And in the world right now, a lot of people know that they're interacting with AI through a generative AI chatbot. But there's so much potential for it to be so much more and more beneficial. And because of that, like if we believe that it can help us fight climate, if it can help us fight disease, if it can drive economic prosperity, then it's our responsibility to lean into these conversations sooner rather than later and to stick with it.
Yep.
I would add that, there are kind of concerns and harms that are happening now with technology. Yep. So I mentioned facial recognition technology, false arrest. There are complications with regards to hiring pools and recruitment tools and the use of the technologies there. And it's also the fact that even Bard, ChatGPT, let's use all the brands, so as not to single out a single brand, they're not quite ready for prime time. I mean, the hallucinations are a problem. If you watched the 60 Minutes segment with our colleagues from Google, they went back and fact-checked what they were told about economic data. It was wrong, right? There's reporting every day.
There was whole presentations using it.
Yeah, and so there are sort of legitimate concerns, and I think whether or not regulation has worked in the past, to the extent that all of us who raised their hand here and said we think it's a net positive, the net positive, we've got to get it there.
Yeah.
And right now the tools are very early stage, and it's exciting, but we've got to be willing to put in the time and the money and the energy to make sure they're ready.
Christina, is it big tech that is going to shape these tools? The companies that have been working on this for a long time, that are having partnerships across the space, or do you think that it's an incumbent, a new company that comes in and develops the space? Who is going to own it when we get there, whether that's 5, 10, 15 years from now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But on the point of, just coming back to the point of regulation, because regulation will to some extent determine that potentially, right? If we're locking in a regulatory model that solidifies the lead for a small number of incumbents, or if we're going more into the open source realm. But I would say, just backing up on regulation and the real risks today, government agencies in the US, for example, have already said, look, AI is not a shield from liability. If you're using AI in an HR context and you're discriminating or it's having a disparate impact on a particular population, you're responsible for owning that. So already today, deployers of AI have to have principles in place and rules in place that ensure that the AI that they're using is not violating existing law, whether that be in the space of financial decisions, in the space of HR or employment decisions, these really high-risk uses of the technology. So you have to have rules in place today. So I think we're still answering these questions about what it looks like. But what we've been advocating for at IBM is let's focus on the risks that they're playing out today on real people and apply a stricter set of regulatory requirements in these high-risk uses of AI.
So the regulatory bodies right now, the FTC, the DOJ, have this reputation for being hard on M&A activity, especially with the big tech players. We talk about maybe, I don't know if you think we should be protecting some of the incumbents from being gobbled up by big tech, but what Microsoft did with OpenAI was so interesting, right? You would think that if that was a merger or an acquisition, it wouldn't have gone through. Instead, it was this $10 billion investment that gave it all the power and access.
It was a compute investment.
Exactly, and also you imagine that OpenAI couldn't exist without that compute power, right? Lila, as someone who works at sort of a competitor, Google, who they've been in this sort of AI arms race, what did you make of that?
Well, when DeepMind was a startup, one of the challenges that the organization faced was this: how do you, to do this type of long-term research requires a level of investment, and that's where the partnering with Google came in. With the acquisition in 2014. And I would say that right now we're all working collaboratively as an industry of looking at what is our responsibility in developing this technology. So one of the things, just to go back to something Christina was talking about, we're thinking about pioneering responsibly. This effort is we have to be having our own internal way of governance. There's the external world, but we have to have this internally. What governance mechanisms do we have as an organization? How do we think about our responsibility related to research, and then deployment and impact, and how do we bring that impact back in? And I think all of us are all the fellow travelers in the space of artificial intelligence right now are going through very similar journeys, and we're having these conversations with government and civil society so that we can share best practices, because I think as an industry we realize that it's important to be talking about how do we be innovative and bold, but also still be responsible.
I want to kind of pick up on a conversation we had in the last panel, because it seemed to touch a few nerves, and I didn't get a straight answer from my panelists, so I'm going to try and ask you guys. I want to look at the question of ChatGPT or BARD or generative AI in the education system. We had a student in the last panel say, my colleagues are using it to write their essay, so-and-so. And the question I asked the panelists that I want to ask you as well, Alondra, I'll start with you on the end. At what age do you think we should start introducing these chatbots to kids?
Oh, I don't think it's about age. I think as soon as you would have introduced a typewriter to them, or as soon as their parents allow them to use screens, I think. But we need to think about what we're using it for. So in the same way, you wouldn't just give your child an iPad and say, go about it, or you don't just allow them to watch anything on cable. I mean, I think those are the conversations that we need to have. I would also say that we need to be thinking about before we spin the tools out, like, what do we want in the education space? What do teachers want? How do we help teachers? I mean, this is just a microcosm of the bigger question. So I think for me, the bigger question around these technologies is like, what do we want them to do for us?
Right.
And that we should be able to have sort of collective, collaborative conversations about what that is. And in the space of education, that means how do we help teachers before the tools are released to produce the modules and the discussion sets and these sorts of things, so you don't have to have a panic on the nightly news, ABC7, with people saying the school board has shut down all of the technology in the school. There could have very easily been, I think, a different kind of conversation about that. It could have been, news coverage in schools with them saying, we've got these exciting modules we got from the company and we're rolling this out with the students. And so, we just need to take this opportunity to slow down, have some forethought, work collaboratively to think about what we're trying to accomplish in classrooms, and work to help teachers, professors accomplish that.
Well, Christina, do we have time to slow down? Students are already using this. I think about my own 7-year-old, if I should show him what this thing is. And there's the idea, too, that if they start using it at a young age, it takes away their ability for creative thought. What do you think? For your child, niece, nephew, whatever it is, would you give them those tools right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. One I don't encounter every day in my job as an enterprise technology company, so it's not a space we're in. But as my personal views, look, I mean, it's out, right? And I think that the more we can teach children and those who are supervising children, like parents and educators who are sort of caught in the middle of this whole thing, I think our children will be able to figure it out a lot more quickly in some cases than, the middle ground of the parents and the teachers that really need to be able to distinguish between what's generated by an AI and what isn't, and need to ensure that they are properly advising students about what they can be used and telling them when it's not okay, by the way, to use it, because they're not going to learn some foundational skills like writing on their own and structure. So I think that's really critically important. I don't think we're going to slow down development. So we got to speed up what we're offering to the educators in the world. And then I think companies that are deploying these kinds of technologies, it's one thing to have a policy that says, don't use this if you're under 18. We have to recognize that that's absolutely baloney. I mean, if I could say that, right? I mean, the kids are using it.
Yeah.
They're using it to generate essays and various other things today. So what is the responsibility on those who are deploying those technologies? What do they owe to the educators, to the community, to help enforce those rules and provide education and the like if they're putting technologies out there?
Lila, last word. I mean, like you have sort of a kids' YouTube. Could you have a kids' Bard? I'll use Bard, not ChatGPT.
Well, actually, if I can take a step back and think about education and learning overall, this is an area I'm particularly passionate about.
Yes.
First of all, as a child of immigrants, I've really felt the importance of education and what it means to have more equitable access. And it's been a thread throughout my career. So, whether I was at Intel leading our education platform group globally, whether it was in the startup Coursera and being the first business executive, or my nonprofit Team for Tech, which was my Aspen Crown Fellow project, actually, which focuses on education technology in underserved communities. Like, this is something I'm personally passionate about. And so now it's like all my worlds are colliding. Right. I think that what's important for us in thinking about education and learning is this is a life, we have to think about the entire continuum of learning. So in like K-12, students understanding to the point made of like, how do you use this technology responsibly? How do you get better at asking prompts? How do you quote your sources? I have a daughter with dyslexia, and it's, honestly, as a parent, I have like a little bit of mixed, how did I learn and putting that on her? But at the same time, like I see her confidence bloom because she's now able to express things in a way that even 6 months ago,
With the help.
with the help of with technology, technology in a moderated way.
And we're talking generative AI, a chatbot?
And just getting the, finding sometimes the words to do it. But, she also uses things like grammar check and other technologies. So I think it's more of like, it's a tool that's in her toolkit now and not, in and of itself. But also within Google DeepMind, we've done a lot of work to try to make sure that we're not leaving people behind and further driving a divide. So we're doing work with the Raspberry Pi Foundation, if people are familiar with age 11 to 14, on how do you talk about AI, like experience AI. So we build that into the curriculum, starting with underserved communities. We've also done work in lifelong learning with like women in ML or lesbians in tech. We're doing work in Africa to do a master's program for AI that scales across the continent based out of South Africa. And it's all about education is going to be important. These are the generations that are going to live with the technology we're developing. If they don't have the tools, if it's not equitable access, if they don't know how to responsibly use it, we're creating more of a problem. So we need to get these generations thinking about how they can use the technology in a responsible way.
I love how that loops back to your first answer, why you're doing this. That was a nice cycle. And I'm going to open it up to Q&A in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you as a question because I've been thinking about this all morning. I heard it this morning. It was a question posed by Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz. He asked, if we had generative AI back in the 1600s, what would it have said about Galileo? Would it have used all the information that existed in that world to say that he was wrong, that the Earth is flat? Or would it have been able to use all the mathematics, and I don't know what, to tell him that he was right? And also, then we won't go here, but what would the church do? Anyways, that first question, though. What do you think? Is it possible to know? Because that has huge implications, right, for the era that we're going into, leaning on generative AI to give us answers to questions based on math and what is out there, some misinformation.
So I'm going to be very historical and literal. I'm going to put on my professor hat and say the corpus that the generative AI would have been trained on in 1600 would have been the Bible. And so it would have, it would not have been a corpus of math and science. Okay. This would have been like sort of pre-Enlightenment. And so it would have told him probably that he was wrong.
You were ready for that question.
Or certainly that it was sacrilegious, if nothing else.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. It comes back to what I mentioned earlier about the data. We all have to be really conscious of what's going into training the large language models of today and the data that we're using to feed it. And if it's, if we're frozen in time, which we would have been based on, the content that was fed.
But would it have been able, Lila, to take in his calculations?
But if you think about it, why go back to 1600s? Go back 10 years.
Sure.
Right? Like, if we had even that grounded on certain ethics or perspectives of that time, how much has changed? I think that's part of the reason why we need to be having conversations and bringing in diverse perspectives and thinking beyond just generative AI.
Yep.
I think that's, there's a lot to be learned from putting yourself in a time machine and going back, but you really don't have to go back that far.
And that's something that's going to be really important as we enter into a new election cycle. We can talk about the implications of that too, but I do want to give our audience a chance to ask questions. I'm going to give my first question to Leslie because I promised you I would at the last session, and it was a fantastic question in the blue here.
Great. So you use terms like, what is our responsibility? We owe these generations. And so I think I did not raise my hand because I don't know that if it's a benefit or I don't know where I land. And so I think my question is what are you doing now to make sure that when we get there, wherever there is, that the communities that we know are typically on the back end of benefiting actually arrive with us, right? So
it's about access, it's about representation.
It's actually not just about access, it's about shaping.
Yeah.
It's about you not coming to me when it's done to see how what I need, but me being at the table. And so it is why I'm hesitant, because when we look at not AI, but when we look at how the communities of color embraced the COVID shots, the vaccines, they were so far on the end of the information that it took people a long time to get with it if they wanted to. So my question is, can we learn from some things, and what are we doing now?
Absolutely. Can I go ahead?
Go ahead, please.
As an operator, like this is so important to everything that we do. It's how do we bring those outside? First of all, how do we think about that within the organization as we're building it? And that's like do we have the right governance models? Do we have diverse perspectives around the table? You can't have a bunch of researchers talking to each other about a technology. So do you have the socio-technical folks? Do you have diversity and views? But we do a lot externally, and we do that because as much as we'll focus internally, it's still not enough. So one example we've recently done is in partnership with the Aspen Institute, where we did something on what does it mean to build equitable AI. So we hosted a series of roundtables with people that, we deliberately went out and said we need to have constructive conversations of what does it even mean when we say equitable AI? Can we align on actions and a framework? So we co-published a report. And I think we need to be doing that, scale that way up. We regularly do sessions. We just did one on education. We're doing some work with disabilities as well we know that we have a limited view. So how do we take our AI knowledge, share it, but also bring that voice into the development? When we did our AlphaFold database system, we actually took it out. We brought in over 35 experts from the field and also the neglected disease organizations, because we needed to know, should we release it or not? Have we represented enough different views, et cetera? So I think there's so much work that needs to be done, but it is something all our organizations are actively engaging. And this is where leadership is really critical. You need the leadership to provide this space and the accountability internally in order to have this built into the culture.
It's a great question. Thank you for that. Let's get to another one in the back there. Behind, sorry. And then we can go to you.
No. So obviously the genie's out of the bottle, and we need to do a lot and figure this out. But right now, in the immediate sense, for instance, the election year, which is a pretty important categories, with all the misinformation from the AI manipulation of video, audio, print, everything, the misinformation, how do we source and make intelligent decisions now with all the manipulation out there and all the platforms? I mean, what is your thought or suggestion how you maneuver the truth, facts, in this?
Alondra, do you want to take this? Your experience in government?
It's a problem we had with the 2020 election. It's a problem that we've had in the 20th century. So we've had to be better consumers and I think better curators of information over time at a kind of faster pace. I will just repeat what I said before, that what we face now is a kind of scale and velocity of misinformation, and the fact that lots of different actors who wouldn't have been able to do it before can now do it, deep fakes, video, voice, and the like. So, there are things that companies can do. We know that for child sex trafficking, exploitation materials, that you can use digital fingerprinting, you can use watermarking, and these sorts of things are already being used in that space. The question is whether or not we need to think about putting those in all tools in a really sort of general way. It's expensive. I think there's lots of reasons companies may not want to do it, and it's not going to fix the problem. I think part of it is that we need to anticipate that this is going to be a kind of whack-a-mole problem that we're always going to have as the technology changes. But at the very least, I think to have systems have to say, this was generated with AI. So Amy Klobuchar and Yvette Clarke, Congresswoman, or Senator and Congresswoman respectively, have legislation that would basically expand existing election campaign laws that would say you would have to disclose on a campaign ad that you've used artificial intelligence. So there are things that we can do. It's not going to solve it. And so if we go into the problem thinking that we're going to fix it in perpetuity, we're not going to. But there's certainly more that we could be doing in this moment to make that the case. I'll also just add, part of the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights that we worked on in the White House, one of the sort of high aspirational principles there is that you should know when an AI system is being used. So none of these levers accounts for bad actors, accounts for malicious actors that are out to deceive you. But there's a lot more that we could be doing to help good actors sort of, attest to what they're doing using these technologies.
Are you more or less worried about this election cycle and the role of misinformation than you were 4 years ago? I'll ask each of you that.
I'm the same worried. I mean, the Mid-Journey stuff looks clunky. The ads you're seeing. There was a Canadian example. The person had 3 arms. That was in the ad, in the advertisement.
Like a bad Photoshop.
Yeah, the Balenciaga Pope. The Balenciaga Pope, which is the Pope in the puppy designer jacket, tells us 2 things. One, it was sort of clunky. There were if you looked at the image, you could see very well that it was generated by AI.
Well, hold on. Who knew that was? I didn't. I will say, when I first saw that picture, I thought, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But on the other hand, the sort of reporting on that was, it was a 30-year-old construction worker in his house that was just like, I'm going to play around with this. So it's the 2 poles,
It was debunked quickly.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I would say I'm a little less worried. And the reason why I'm a little less worried is because 2 years ago, we weren't having these conversations at the scale at which we're having them today. And in one sense, that's a good thing, because people will be a little more weary of learier of what you see and whether it's true or not true. On the other hand, that's pretty sad that we have to question everything that we see. And I don't know what the answer is in the end. It comes back to a lot of what you recommended in terms of watermarking, which is still a technology that's not fully developed, but needs to be. Like, this is where we need to be spending our time as technology companies, to ensure that we are developing technologies to make the output of these models more trustworthy, to ensure that people have a way of determining, so you can, basically instill trust, so that we're not questioning everything we see and read.
And a quick last word from you, Lila, and we'll get to some more questions.
I think they covered it well. I also would just remember that there are elections happening all over the world, and next year is a particularly intense election cycle in many places. So I think that's actually, I think that's probably a little bit more heightened next year because of that. But to the other points, I'm well aligned with their thinking.
Question, I skipped over you in the puffy coat here.
Hi, thank you so much for this. So of course, Google and IBM have the size and the resources to have ethics panels and build those kind of conversations into the workflow, but the ecosystem is much bigger than these big companies. Obviously, generative AI is kind of the tech of the moment. There's a lot of startups, scrappy, venture capital, and one of the lessons we might have taken away from social media is that sometimes the ethics can kind of lag behind the money when that's the case. So I guess in that sense, is that something we should be worried about, the kind of the venture capital ecosystem with startups, or is this all gets they might get absorbed into the big companies anyway at some point, so it'll all even out.
Who wants to take this? Got 2 big tech people here.
Well, I used to be I was at Kleiner Perkins, and so in venture capital, and I do a lot with the startup community, both in the US and Europe. And my point is that responsibility has to be built in from the start. It's not a bolt-on. Like, that's when you run into problems. Even at DukeMind, I may have joined 5 years ago, but the company had AI principles from the very start in 2010 that are part of our governance process. So I'm actually actively engaging with the startup community. I'm not the only one. There's lots of people who are doing that, because I think these conversations need to happen publicly, and it needs to be all organizations, nonprofits, everyone developing technology around this, because that's the only way we're really going to ensure a better future. And it's part of the reason why we're trying to say where and how can we share best practices. So we may have some of the resources to do some of this, but we've published papers. So we held back our first generative language model paper until we had done an ethics research paper around the taxonomy of language. How do you talk about both the risk and the benefits of this so that it could benefit the entire community? I think that's part of how we see
Yeah,
our-
and the other thing I would just add is it's incumbent upon companies that are the deployers. So it's a pretty complicated ecosystem in, AI. But companies that are, in the end, deploying these technologies that are going to touch people, they need to be asking questions of the technology that they're procuring and the providers that they're using. And as Lila said, working on commonly accepted set of practices, like what does an audit look like? We're still working on these kinds of things. What does a conformity assessment look like? Those, the benefit of that research with a broad group of researchers participating in it from the whole community will help to inform that as we go, and then companies deploying the technologies need to be asking these questions before they're procuring technology.
Let's get to another question in the yellow up here.
Thank you. I just want to return to elections for a moment, because we often talk about our concerns and misinformation, disinformation, and I'm curious, are there opportunities when it comes to elections with this kind of technology, with election administration or other ways to create efficiencies to make sure our elections are more trusted, work more effectively? I have no idea, but I'm just curious, as we've talked about net benefits and net challenges.
I only have a little information on this. I mean, maybe, but I think we're like sort of early stage here. I mean, there's evidence that using some of the chatbots to ask where your voting booth is, or that the information's not entirely accurate. So I think potentially they could be chatbots themselves could be, excellent resources for that, but they're not quite there yet. But I do think they're probably things that you can do potentially at scale, and Lila and Christina might talk about with regards to energizing, educating voters and the like.
Yeah, I would just say on the cybersecurity front, right? So there are cyber threats to election systems and processes and the like, and one of the, I think, best use cases for this kind of technology is to stay ahead of the threat in the cyberspace. So to be able to real-time detect new threats and respond to them in an automated way, and scaling that across enterprises, like across our election system. So that's one area, not just in the election space, but one area in the cyberspace where it could be helpful.
I'm glad you bring that up. That's one area we haven't talked about today, where a lot of folks see a lot of threats and possibility. Let's get another one in, this gentleman on the right here.
Hi. One of the concerns I have about, I kind of like it. It's a new tool. It's fun to play with and everything. And there's great possibilities, obviously, with science and health and education. But my concern is the amount of energy that's used in order to do this, just like with Bitcoin. And we saw the climate issue that's created by this kind of technology. So when you're speaking about the ethics, how do you balance it out with the catastrophe of climate change that's coming down the tubes?
So just really quickly, I mean, that's part of what the technology that IBM is looking at is like, how do we train models using less energy? Or how do you train purpose-built? So we're an enterprise company, so we're not, our clients are not going to use a chatbot in their enterprises that isn't sort of smaller, domain-specific, because you can't, for example, if our client is a bank, they need to trust the output, so they're using essentially smaller, purpose-built models. I think that is some of the way that climate change will be addressed, but then coming back to the points we raised earlier about the potential for these large language models, like we have one with NASA that has all the satellite data, and that can help to essentially address and proactively respond to climate change because you're monitoring it on such a huge scale. So it can help solve those kind of problems too. So I think it's sort of twofold.
And we're doing some work with controlling plasma and nuclear fusion reactors, which could actually unlock, it's one of the core safety issues in unlocking a new type of energy source. But we're also thinking about how do you build better models, and it's very much on everyone's mind right now, given the sustainability goals, even from the UN. So we're all, I think, approaching it in similar ways.
Better chips, too, right?
Yes.
And better technology.
I would just point that at the White House, we did an energy usage report on Bitcoin and digital assets. And I think a lot of the conclusions there are the same here. I mean, that this is a place where the sort of ethics in the society that we're trying to get to and the innovation can actually be quite tightly paired. And I think some of the examples that they laid out here about how to innovate and using less energy are exactly the kinds of things we need to be thinking about with the risks and harms and problems that we're coming up. How do we use the innovation space as a solution set and not as, posing it as a contrast to being able to do innovation and to grow markets?
I'm going to squeeze in one more quick question, if you can make it quick, in the back there.
Hello, my name is Amelia Delia Gundupe, and I'm a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow. First, I want to say the panel looks great. I love seeing 4 women up there talking about AI. This question is to Alondra. How do you see us actualizing the AI Bill of Rights, and what do you think the government's responsibility is to not only minimize the risk in the space, but also to make sure that vulnerable communities, Black and brown folks, aren't left behind? And if Lila wants to add, what do you think that the US can learn from the UK in this space? Thanks.
Good question.
So the AI Bill of Rights is 5 principles: data privacy, protection from algorithmic discrimination, notice and explanation. You should know when an algorithmic system is being used. An alternative, there should be some alternative or fallback, if you want, in those systems, and that the system should be safe and effective. Very high level, I think not a lot to disagree with. Obviously, the devil is in the details of how you get to each of those things through kind of socio-technical apparatuses that are levers and regulations and guidance and policy and technical things like assessment and auditing. That came out in October 2022 with a government sort of paper called a fact sheet. And the fact sheet already began to sort of talk about how government could implement that. So the fact sheet came out saying that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was already looking at how the American with Disabilities Act, for example, applied to the use of AI tools and systems in hiring. It was already the case that the Department of Health and Human Services was looking at health discrimination and health equity issues with the use of healthcare algorithms and some of the work that they fund as a grantor of research and also in the research that they do as an organization. So it's already the case. I think maybe Christina said this. Obviously Lena Khan at the FTC has explicitly said, that the use of AI tools is not an exemption from the law. So any laws that apply in any of these domains or sectors with AI apply without AI as well. And so I think there are things already that government can do. It would be great, certainly part of I have a toehold in the Center for American Progress. The Center for American Progress has asked for an executive order to effectively implement the AI Bill of Rights. And part what that would do is have government as the world's largest employer, the world's largest consumer and vendor tools in AI, help to be an exemplar and help to sort of change norms and companies with regards to more equitable, trustworthy AI. With regards to, this goes back to Leslie's question, communities of color in particular. This is the thing that I worry about. I worry that I have written in my career about particularly African-American communities as innovators in the space of genetic screening and counseling, in the space of direct-to-consumer genetics, for example, and losing the ability for these communities to participate, to gain the economic opportunity and to innovate because the tools are already causing harm in the communities, I think is a big concern that we should be really worried about.
On that note, I'm going to end it here, guys. That was amazing. We went over. We could go way over, but I'll refrain from doing that. Thank you all for your great questions and listening. Lila, Christina, Alondra, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.